Okay, so apparently I'm an idiot and everybody on the channel wanted a video explaining the difference between variable and constant processor / GPU clock speeds. I guess it is my fault that I've never made the video because I was under the assumption that you knew what they were. I've brought them up in several videos before, and it's pretty ironic that the topic that I thought nobody wanted to hear is actually the topic that everybody wants to hear about. So I don't know. That whole situation was pretty funny. Almost as funny as The Last of Us Part 2's story. Joking, I'm joking. But all jokes aside, if you guys haven't seen my review for The Last of Us Part 2 yet, go check it out. It's the first formal review I've done for the channel, but I think it turned out pretty well. Link in the description, as well as an icon card above. Short plug aside, if you're new to the channel, my name's Innocent and I just so happen to be a rising computer engineer who is currently one assignment away from dropping out of college. Also a joke, though I wish it wasn't. And if you haven't guessed already, today we're going to be discussing the PS5's variable clock speed and pinning it against something with a constant clock speed, like the Xbox Series X, for example. We're going to be seeing exactly how a variable clock speed affects a given processor's performance and potentially speculate as to which of the two consoles will come out on top. Now, before we officially get started, I must preface this by saying that a lot of what I'm about to tell you will be drastically oversimplified, because I can't really expect to teach you all the ins and outs of a computer processor in a YouTube video, and that's for two main reasons. Reason number one, it would be ridiculously hard, complex, and boring to watch. Like, I'm not going to teach you what an operational amplifier is and how it's used in processors, because quite frankly, I wished I'd never learned it myself. Kill me. And reason number two, twice a year I watch thousands of dollars leave my bank account to pay for this thing called university. So no, I'm not game sharing my university with you. Buy your own copy, sheesh. If I'm gonna fall victim to an unfair and manipulative trade, I at least want to act like I got a good deal. Also a joke. Kinda. But jokes aside, fret not, I'm going to be doing everything I can to explain this topic in a form that is digestible and easy to understand. Feel free to let me know how I did in the comments down below. Okay, so variable clock speed. Interesting phrase, but before we talk about that, let's talk about clock speed. And before we talk about that, let's talk about clocks. What is a clock? Most of you guys might know it as, that thing that hangs on your wall and keeps track of time. But what does it mean in terms of computers? Well, the exact same thing. Seriously. A clock in a processor keeps track of time, and you might be like, what exactly does that mean though? So allow me to explain a bit further. A common misconception that most people have about processors is that they are a single piece that operates as a simple in and out mechanism that processes data. But that's not at all true. A processor is actually composed of a bunch of different parts within the component itself that work together to make the entire processor. And for the sake of this video, we could separate those parts within the processor into three main components: a memory unit, an arithmetic and logic unit, and a control unit. And remember, all three of these units are what make up the entire processor. They work together to be the processor. Together, they are the processor. Now, each of these units have their own specific tasks that they must perform in order for the processor to operate properly, and they all have to do with the processor's clock. So before we explain exactly what a clock is, we'll briefly explain all three units and what they do, so you can have some greater context on how said clock affects each part of the processor. Starting off with the memory unit. This section itself deals with controlling three main parts of your system: ROM, RAM, and cache. So let's explain those three too. ROM stands for read-only memory, and it is memory that is non-volatile, as in it can continue to store data even when no power is being delivered to it. This means that ROM memory is very sturdy and isn't easily corruptible. ROM memory would be the equivalent of something that is pretty much permanent and unchanging, like a tattoo for example. Once you get a tattoo, you can't change it, and restarting your computer, or showering in the case of the tattoo, won't get rid of it. You'll always be able to read it and obtain whatever information is stored there unless it's physically destroyed, or in the case of the tattoo, you go through some pretty painful surgery. You can typically find that ROM memory is directly attached to the motherboard of whatever computer you're inspecting. It's also usually where your console or PC's BIOS firmware is stored. And an example of firmware is your PlayStation safe mode, or that black screen you always get when updating. These protocols aren't stored directly on your hard drive, but on your PlayStation's ROM, so they can't ever be changed, hence the term safe mode. On the off chance that your PlayStation ever gets corrupted, using the BIOS stored on ROM to instruct a new boot will always be possible, since it's pretty much impossible to corrupt ROM. Again, safe mode. And ROM is not to be confused with mass storage like SSDs or hard drive, as those are separate things entirely. And finally, ROM communicates with the memory unit on the processor directly, usually through an interface like a CPU socket or a direct integration into the motherboard like in consoles. Next up is RAM, and I'm sure you all know what this is, considering that it too has been used as a metric to fling insults at each other in the everlasting console debate, which I honestly don't understand, but I digress. But in case you haven't heard of it, it stands for Random Access Memory, and it stores all things that may need to be quickly accessed by your processor, and in the case of consoles, your graphics card as well. Things like assets and textures would typically be stored in RAM while you're playing a game for ease of reach. It differs from ROM in that it is able to be changed and is in fact constantly changing as you play different games. And unlike ROM, it is volatile, meaning that if you suddenly turn off the power, not only do you lose whatever data you were storing on RAM, but you also run the risk of significantly damaging the component. And if that ever happens, that's usually when Big Brother ROM would have to come in and perform a safe boot, to make sure everything is still operating properly after a sudden electrical shutdown, which I'm sure you guys have probably experienced at least once. However, similarly to ROM, RAM has a direct connection to your processor through the same CPU socket or direct solder onto the motherboard, and that's pretty much RAM, so let's move on to cache. Cache is the only type of memory that is located directly within the processor's memory unit itself, unlike ROM and RAM, which we just saw is controlled by the memory unit through an interface. And cache deals with storing any super high priority data that needs to be accessed often and immediately without having to take the time to travel through any interfaces. Things like operating system instruction sets or thermal failsafe limits, because those things are pretty important. And with that being said, you now know what ROM, RAM, and cache are, and how they interact with any given processor. And again, these three components are controlled by the processor's memory unit. But now let's move on to the processor's arithmetic and logic unit, which deals with the bulk of all data processing that happens within the component. Things like all simple operations like addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division, though I guess you can't really call it simple when it's happening billions of times per second. Regardless, that's where the arithmetic part of the name comes from. The logic part of the name, however, It is with great sadness that I will not be explaining what exactly logic means in terms of the arithmetic and logic unit, and that's because it's, complex to stay family friendly. And I know that's going to disappoint a lot of you, and I'm sure tons of you guys would want to know exactly what it means, but trust me, how it works is not within the confines of this video, at all. But at the same time, don't be too disappointed if you happen to catch my TeraFLOPs explain video, because then you already have a great idea of what exactly is going on here. Even though the TeraFLOP video primarily focused on graphics cards, digital logic transcends component specialization, so everything you learned in that video can in fact be carried over to the logic section of this processor, albeit with very slight differences that don't really matter all things considered. So basically, if you watch my TeraFLOP video, you're probably having a major aha moment right now, because you're kind of seeing everything in the processor come together. The memory unit, which focuses on communicating and transferring needed data, and now the arithmetic and logic unit, which focuses on everything I discussed in the TeraFLOP video, like bits and all that complex computation. But if you haven't watched my TeraFLOP video, or perhaps need a refresher and would like for the properties of the arithmetic and logic unit to be explained further, feel free to check it out after this video. I personally think it'll be worth your time, so I'll link it as an icon right now, as well as put a link in the description. And if you're a new viewer that has absolutely no clue what I'm talking about, for the sake of finishing this video, we'll just say that the logic part of the unit also handles math like the arithmetic part, but just math that may be more complicated than the basic 4, and math that pretty much lets your console operate and play games. But for the most part, that's it. The arithmetic and logic unit handles math. So let's move on to the next part. Okay, so the control unit. This part is probably the easiest of the three to explain since it can be done in one sentence. The control unit controls everything. That's it. Remember that I said that a processor is made up of 3 components? Well, how do those components communicate with one another to always be on the same page? The control unit. The control unit controls and moderates the other 2 parts, as well as issue any directions, cancellations, or whatever it may be. Think of the control unit as the manager of a restaurant, then the arithmetic and logic unit would be the chef, and the memory unit and company would be your server. and they all work together to bring you a great experience. And that's it. That's what the control unit does. Pretty much just issue orders and organize everything. So now you might be scratching your head and wondering, that's all fine and dandy, but what does this have to do with variable clock speed? Well, Mr. and Miss Impatient, don't worry, we're finally getting into that. So without further ado, allow me to explain. We know that internal memory like RAM, ROM, and cache is controlled by the memory unit, and that the memory and logic units are controlled by the control unit. But what controls the control unit? Like, how does it know what to do in order to keep everyone on the same page? Well, enter the processor's internal clock, which just so happens to be stored within the control unit. And a processor's clock is just like any other clock. Its job is essentially just to keep track of time, kinda like a metronome that is constantly running in the background that allows all parts of the processors to know exactly when to operate. Without this clock or metronome, the control unit could give as many orders as it wants to the other two units, but there would be no coordination and the operation would simply fail each time. To give an example, take a listen to this right here. Hey, memory unit, I need you to retrieve some data for me. I need to send it over to Arithmetic and Logic so she can get these game assets ready to go to graphics card. Sure, which assets? The one with the armored knight with the long spear. You know, the first boss fight. Armored knight boss fight. Wait, these again? Yeah, I don't really know what happened. What do you mean you don't know what's happening? This is the 5th time I've sent these over. Yeah, listen man, the player just keeps dying. I don't know what else to tell you. How has he died 4 times to the same boss already? Bro, it's Dark Souls. Cut him some slack. Jeez, relax. Whatever man, I got the assets right here. Alright, send them over. Okay. You're not sending them over. You never said when. Oh, my bad, send them over now. What's now? You know, the present moment. Bro, we're machines. We don't have any sense of time. Damn, you're right. Clock. Stop sleeping on the job. What's up? I'm up. Sorry, bro. I had a long night. Jesus, man, what happened? I don't know, man. Last night, the owner just kept overclocking until I couldn't anymore. Damn, bro. I hope you'll be alright, but we kinda need you now, so do you mind? Yeah, bro, of course. Okay, now send those assets over on the 3rd tick from now. Alright, here you go. God, finally. I hope that little skit kind of illustrated as to why having a processor clock is so important for the coordination between all components of a CPU. Without it, they simply could not coordinate or work with each other at all. The clock's job is supposed to be the bridge that connects all parts to one another and gives them a basis for operation. A basis that humans don't notice and often take for granted: time. And that's all a clock is. It just allows the components to quote unquote talk to one another. And if you want to know how a processor clock looks and operates in the real world, well, you obviously can't because nowadays they're microscopic, but here's an older and bigger one. So yeah, this right here is a processor clock. And using some fancy technology known as an electronic oscillator, it is able to use its internal metronome to generate an electronic sine wave at a particular frequency. You might know this frequency as clock speed, which today is typically measured in gigahertz, and this clock speed obviously varies from processor to processor. For the Xbox Series X, this clock speed or frequency is 3.8 gigahertz or 3.8 billion clock ticks per second, which obviously is a lot, so we're going to zoom in a bit. And for the PS5, its clock speed is variable, so that simply means it ranges from, and this is obviously not confirmed so don't attack me in the comments, let's say a minimum of 3 gigahertz to a maximum of 3.5 gigahertz. And as you can see, nothing has changed within the PS5 or this chart. Like, there's no special magic per se behind a variable frequency, it's just a clock speed that changes based on your needs. And I only mention this because I think a lot of people have the misconception that a variable clock frequency fundamentally changes the intricacies of a processor to the point that it might as well be some alien technology. But it really doesn't. It's still a processor, just one that uses some more fancy tech that I won't get into to change its frequency at will. So there you go. Now you know what a variable clock speed is. Just an internal processor clock that could change its pace on the fly. And now to answer the questions that must be on everyone's mind right now. What is the point of a variable clock speed? And how does having a higher clock speed mean better performance if it only simulates time? Well, to answer those questions, we need to first look at the benefits and drawbacks of having a very high clock frequency in any given processor. Having a higher clock frequency simply means that the control unit will be able to send out more orders and more requests more frequently, thus in turn making the memory and logic units perform at a faster pace, which makes the overall processor faster. Hence why having a higher clock speed usually means better performance for processors on the same architecture. But that high frequency also means that more heat will be generated, since the electric components within all three units have less time in between clock ticks to cool off before starting a new operation. Higher and higher frequencies also consume a very large amount of power at a diminishing return rate. And that's where variable clock speed comes in. What if, now hear me out, we can boost our processor to a higher frequency for as long as we can, but as soon as we smell trouble, like high power consumption or excessive heat for example, we just bump the frequency back down for a bit and pretend like nothing ever happened. You know, until the coast is clear and we inevitably go back up. That's what variable frequencies are all about. They allow for the finer control of power consumption and heat, as well as, fun fact, being a lot cheaper to manufacture. And this is at the cost of slightly slower operation when it's compared to its high frequency counterpart. Now, most modern computers use variable frequency components mainly because of cost effectiveness as well as the potential to hit high clock speeds that you really shouldn't be hitting at all, you know, before having to go back down. And as a rising computer engineer, I think that's the beauty of variable clock speeds. The fact that they allow you to reach heights that you couldn't have without it. And the fact that they're cheaper to make respective to performance, so yay for our wallets. Okay, so now onto the final part of this video, which is going to be pretty brief, don't worry, but it's about how these two different philosophies will impact the two consoles in their battle against one another, or Google, Amazon, or whoever Phil Spencer wants to fight. And my opinion on that is that the Xbox Series X will most likely draw more power than the PS5, run hotter, and in turn also be louder as well, while of course being faster than the PS5 for its troubles. The PS5 on the other hand will be roughly between 3 and 600 MHz slower, but in turn receive a cooler running system that draws less power as well as runs quieter at home. And I talked about the heat dissipation and power consumption system of the PS5 and how it stacks up against the Xbox Series X in the latter half of my PS5 reveal breakdown video if you wanted to check it out. It'll be popping up as an icon right now as well as appear as a link in the description. And with the final plug made, that's gonna wrap up today's video on the PS5's variable clock speed and what it means for you as a gamer, as well as how it stacks up against the Xbox Series X. And I don't particularly do this often, but guys, if you liked the video, be sure to give it a share on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Reddit, iMessage, or whatever the cool kids are using these days, I don't know. But without further ado, dudes and dudettes, if you liked the video, leave a like. If you dislike the dislike, and be sure to subscribe so you never miss a future upload from the channel. And potentially hit that bell notification button if you're so inclined. I've been Innocence, you've been the audience, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace out.